Well, good morning. It's good to be here with you this morning. We are here for the purpose of adoring Jesus Christ and getting to be here together in union because of what he has done for us. I want to share a passage with you as we get started this morning from Matthew 17, beginning in verse 22, to get us started with what we're going to talk about. Matthew chapter 17, that's where we will be spending our time this morning, is in this gospel. In Matthew chapter 17, beginning in verse 22, as they were gathering in Galilee, Jesus said to them, "The Son of Man is about to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him, and he will be raised on the third day." And they were greatly distressed. I think all of us have had our hands tied up in something. Maybe you're a jack of all trades. Perhaps your hands are busy taking care of widows, taking care of those who are poor, teaching others the gospel. All of those things are wonderful things for our hands to be tied up in, to be busy doing. But I think it's also true that all of us have had our hands in the cookie jar, so to speak. It's interesting how Jesus in this passage prophetically tells us that he tells the disciples in this reading how he is going to die. He tells them specifically that he is going to be delivered over into the hands of men. That word delivered, used by Jesus, means betrayed or handed over. Some of your versions may actually say, they're going to hand me over. What's interesting is that the Gospels actually link this word to three different events that connect a person or persons to Jesus' death. And I would just like to take a few moments this morning to look at those three scenarios with you. I want us to consider what their motivation was in handing over the Son of God to be crucified. The very first one that we're going to look at is in Matthew chapter 26. Matthew chapter 26, verses 14 through 16, a very familiar passage. This passage by Matthew indicates that it was out of greed that Judas asked the chief priests, "What will you give me if I hand him over to you?" Beginning in verse 14, then one of the 12, whose name was Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him over to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver, and from that moment he sought an opportunity to betray him. I got to tell you, Judas is an interesting and perplexing character in the story of Jesus. I mean, what would drive a man to hand over another man who has only gone around doing good? You know, Judas witnessed the day-to-day things that Jesus did, from healing the lame and the blind. He saw them laying in the dirt-filled streets, pining for Jesus, for somebody to take notice of them. And you know, Judas saw Jesus, as tired as he was, stoop down and heal those people. Why would Judas deliver Jesus over to be put to death? Perhaps like many of the disciples, he was disappointed that Jesus didn't come bearing arms like this warrior Messiah they were anticipating. Maybe that's why. Perhaps he thought Jesus might escape. He knew the power that Jesus had. Maybe he thought, if I hand him over, he'll find a way to get out of this mess. We aren't given those details, and although all four Gospels tell us Judas played an important role in betraying Jesus, it is Matthew that indicates his motive for doing so. Matthew says, Judas asked, "What will you give me? And I will hand him over." Matthew's telling of this story indicates that Judas brings up the question of money first. When you read this and you look at his question, it all seems to indicate that Judas was expecting a large sum of money. He at least was expecting more than perhaps the disappointed amount of 30 pieces of silver that ended up being agreed upon. And that's what Judas was paid, to find the right time and the right place to have Jesus arrested. It was greed that handed Jesus over. You know, greed will drive a man to do things that he never thought he would do. And Matthew actually seems to be referencing a couple of Old Testament passages. One of those is Zechariah chapter 11. You don't have to turn there, but let me see if I can just set the scene for you. In Zechariah chapter 11, God tells Zechariah, I want you to go and play the part of this good shepherd. I want you to go and I want you to dress up like this shepherd, take these two staffs, and I want you to go and shepherd this flock that's doomed to slaughter. And so Zechariah goes and he does that, and he names two staffs, one union and one favor. Both of these names are characteristics of God. God rules his people with grace, and he rules his people with the desire to have a relationship with them. And Zechariah does his job as a good shepherd does, and he actually goes out and he gets rid of these three old shepherds that seem to be leading the people away from the path, and he's trying to get them back on the right path towards God. But Zechariah in that story starts to weep. He starts to mourn because the people, they don't appreciate what he's trying to do for them. And so Zechariah goes to the shepherd tradesman, and he says, you know what? I'm breaking this covenant. I don't want to be the shepherd anymore if they're not going to appreciate what I'm trying to do for them. And so he breaks the staffs, and he says, I am done as of right now. Go ahead and pay me the sum that you think I'm worth. And so they do. They pay him 30 pieces of silver. And what's interesting is that God tells Zechariah, you take those 30 pieces of silver and you throw them at the potter, because it was the handsome price at which they priced him. In other words, they paid him what they believed him to be worth. For Judas to accept a payment that, according to Exodus 21, was the price of a slave who had been gored to death by an ox, says something about how much they valued the good shepherd, Jesus. He may have wanted more than he got, but even the pitiful sum that he took shows how lightly he regarded Jesus. And in return, he ended up diminishing his own soul. Greed handed the Savior over to death. Let's look at another scene. In Matthew chapter 27 and verse 18, we're told there by Matthew that the priests handed Jesus over to Pilate out of envy. In Matthew chapter 27 and verse 18, this is the scene where Pilate's going to ask them if they want Barabbas. And he says in verse 18, for Pilate knew, that it was out of envy that they had delivered or handed him over, is the word there. They handed him over. And Pilate is another interesting character. He's a frustrating character because he knew Jesus was innocent. He also knew that the chief priests were guilty. I mean, he's no dummy. He observed the crowd. He looked at the priests, and he deduced their real motivation for wanting to kill Jesus. It wasn't about loyalty to the Roman Empire like the priests actually kind of suggested. They were envious, and he knew that their reason was that for handing Jesus over. Pilate saw how popular Jesus had become. He would have observed Jesus turning the Jewish people's attention away from the priests. And if that prior Sunday was any indication, remember the triumphal entry, where Jesus is entering the city, he could barely get in because of all the people surrounding both sides, hailing him as a king. That was the last straw for the Jewish leaders. They were losing their influence, and Pilate recognized that. He saw that. And I think it's feasible to at least consider that Pilate offered to let Jesus take Barabbas' place because he thought, given Jesus' popularity, perhaps the crowd would stand up for Jesus. And Jesus would be set free. But the priests, they're not going to have any of this. They were so envious of a man that had only done good that they ended up actually breaking the 10th commandment. You shall not covet what belongs to your neighbor. So just like greed and envy and jealousy not only handed an innocent man over to death, it also let a dangerous man go free. Have you ever thought about that? The priests care so much for their fame and influence that they were willing to put the people at risk and let a criminal roam the streets. Resentment delivered or handed Jesus over to death. Well, there's one more that Matthew mentions to us. Here in chapter 27 and verse 26, Pilate hands Jesus over to death. And I think if you look at the text, it's out of cowardice that he does that. To see this, you have to back up to verse 24. When Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water and washed his hands before the crowd, saying, I'm innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves. And all the people answered, his blood be on us and on our children. And then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, handed him over to be crucified. Pilate, deep down, probably knew Jesus was undeserving of any of this. I mean, he tried releasing Jesus multiple times. He sent Jesus to Herod to give him a retrial, Luke tells us. He tried to give the case back to the Jewish people, according to John. But at the end of the day, the pressure was mounting on Pilate. And so he washes his hands of the situation. And this is not Matthew's way of exonerating Pilate. In fact, he holds him in contempt just as he does Judas and the chief priests. He is prompted by political and moral cowardice. He feared a mob of people, and he feared the Roman government. One of the things Romans did not tolerate was a division among the people. And when they placed a ruler over a city, they expected him to keep the peace no matter what. So as you can imagine, if an uproar occurred and it couldn't be stopped, and the complaint made its way all the way up to Caesar, what do you think was going to happen to Pilate? Pilate says, it's not my responsibility anymore. It's a similar statement to that of the chief priests that they make to Judas when Judas says, I have betrayed an innocent man. And they say, what is that to us? See to it yourself. You know, the sin of cowardice is an unsavory, an unstable path to walk. A coward doesn't take responsibility for his own actions. He blames other people instead of himself. And so cowardice hands our Savior over to be crucified. Now, I just wonder, what motivated you to hand the Savior over? You ever thought about that question? What is your sin that handed Jesus over? And I don't have to wonder about what mine would have been. If I'm honest with myself, I can pinpoint exactly what would have been my motivation for handing him over. It actually goes back to Judas's question from the very beginning. What are you willing to give me? And I'll hand over Jesus to you. Everybody has a price. That's what the cynic says to the hired assassin who's ready to bargain for over somebody's life. We're here today to appreciate and to adore what Jesus did for us. But before we can see Jesus on the cross as something that's done for us, we have to be able to see Jesus hanging there as something done by us. 'Twas I that shed the sacred blood. I nailed him to the tree. I crucified the Christ of God. I joined the mockery. Of all that shouting multitude, I fell that I'm one. And in that din of voices rude, I recognize my own. Around the cross, the throng I see, mocking the sufferer's groan. Yet still my voice, it seems to be as if I mocked alone. Now, I don't want to leave us in a state where we're just wallowing in what we have done to the Savior. We need to recognize that. But there's another side to this story, and it's found in Ephesians chapter 5. And I'm going to end with this verse. In Ephesians chapter 5, in verse 2, Paul says, "And walk in love, as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and a sacrifice to God." You know what's interesting about that verse? What Paul says there, that Christ gave himself, that's the same word, handed over. It's the same phrase as used to describe what Judas and the priests and Pilate did to him. We're not the only ones who had a hand in the Savior's death. Jesus handed himself over for us. Christ gave himself. But his motivation, it was pure, undefiled love for the very people who handed him over out of evil. Let's think about these things.